Okay, as I do with my classes at UNSW, I'm going to start right on the dot to encourage punctuality later in the conference, and of course later in the term when it's a lecture. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this special session. Excuse my coat and scarf. I'm recovering from a cold and I don't want it to get worse. Particularly because today is a big day on the ACE program and also this evening with the big dialogue about cost of living. So it is my great pleasure to be have sort of curated this session and to have the cooperation of everybody who's going to be in it. This is a session specifically focused on education and education of economists in particular as we move into the session. The first thing that happens, we have three parts basically. The first thing will be an introduction of Julie Berry Cullen, who's one of our wonderful international guest speakers here at ACE, and her talk, which is the R.C. Mills Lecture, sponsored by the University of Sydney's Economics Department. And then we'll have a second session, a second part of the session, which will incorporate a few small presentations, just short mini presentations, 3 slides each, from 3 different sort of perspectives, vantage points, stakeholders in relation to the education of economists. And then the third part of the session, then what will conclude the session, is a panel discussion of economics education, where the central question will be how could the content and pedagogy provided in economics classrooms be improved? And I'll remind everybody of that when we get to that point. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce Stephen Whelan, who is representing the School of Economics at the University of Sydney, to introduce Julie.
So thanks, Gigi, for that introduction. So good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure today to be able to introduce Professor Julie Berry Cullen to give the 2025 R.C. Mills Lecture. Before I do that, I did just want to give you a little bit of background to the R.C. Mills, in particular. So Richard Charles Mills was one of the most eminent Australian economists of the first half of the 20th century. And as Professor and Dean of Economics at the University of Sydney from 1922 until 1945, he made a number of important contributions in the areas of tariff protection, money, banking, and Australian fiscal federalism. Indeed, the University of Sydney is home to the R.C. Mills building, which housed the Faculty of Economics prior to its move to what many of you might be more familiar with, the Merriweather building in 1965. So Professor Mills was also an outstanding educationalist, including as chairman of the Universities Commission from 1942, as one of the initiators of the Australian National University, and from 1950 as chair of the Funding Commission, which largely established the post-war tertiary sector in Australia. So the university established the R.C. Mills Lecture in the late 1950s after Professor Mills' death, and we were delighted last year to be able to re-establish this annual lecture. Our intention is always that the lectures will provide a specific focus on education, including education policy, the regulation and funding of all tiers of education, and the role of education in society. It's not really incumbent on me, it's pretty obvious, to mention the relevance and importance of these issues to today's world. Myself and other heads of disciplines of schools of economics will be discussing exactly these types of issues later today about how we can best reach out and educate those students who choose to study economics at university. For those present, you may not be aware that R.C. Mills was also instrumental in establishing the Economic Society of Australia, including as first president of a New South Wales branch in the 1920s and as Central Council president in the 1930s. We therefore thought it would be fitting that this year's R.C. Mills Lecture should be given here at the Conference of Economists, marking the Society's centenary. Needless to say, we were very pleased that the organisers were enthusiastic about this idea. So with that background in mind, I do want to introduce Professor Julie Berry Cullen, who will be delivering the 2025 R.C. Mills Lecture. Professor Cullen is a public finance economist whose primary research interests are the economics of education and fiscal federalism. She's received a PhD from MIT in 1997, was on the faculty of the University of Michigan until 2004, and has been at the University of California, San Diego ever since. Professor Cullen has a distinguished academic career, including serving in a variety of editorial positions, including as co-editor of the Journal of Human Resources and the Journal of Public Economics, and in policy advisory roles for the states of California and Michigan. Professor Cullen has authored papers investigating the intended and unintended consequences of school finance reforms, school choice policies, school accountability systems, and her work has been published in leading outlets such as the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy, Econometrica, Journal of Human Resources, Journal of Public Economics, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. Today's paper is titled Unintended Consequences of Education Reform, or Education Reforms, and Julie will discuss the findings from several of her studies evaluating reforms intended to improve the efficiency or equity of the provision of education. Those reforms spanned school finance equalisation, school accountability, and guaranteed college admission. The focus is on the consequences that are unintended, such as school or student gaming responses and the lessons for policy design. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Cullen.
Thank you so much. It's really quite an honor to be invited to give the R.C. Mills lecture and also to launch this session. So as you all know and just heard, Mills was really instrumental in establishing the tertiary sector and its design here in Australia, so it had a really lasting impact. So designing regulations, funding systems to try to really expand access and also to ensure quality levels. So governments all over the world intervene really heavily in education at all levels, so the primary, secondary, and the tertiary levels, often with those same goals, okay, with these equity and efficiency or quality goals. So what as a public finance economist, what I want to do to start today is just begin by reviewing, what are some of the classic economic justifications for government intervention in education. Okay, then what I'll turn to for the second part is reviewing several of my studies that look at some of the unintended consequences of policies that are commonly used when governments intervene in education. Okay, so the first, and you're all surely familiar with these, is thinking from an efficiency perspective, and these are cases where we argue that the market itself has some sort of failure. Okay, the first is that education, especially when you think, actually at all levels, often has public good-like and externality-like aspects. So educating, a more educated workforce might have productivity spillovers to others. If we are in a democracy, we'd like people to be as good of citizens as they can possibly be, so increasing their civic participation, reducing reliance maybe on social safety net programs, costs of crime, et cetera. And so all of these say that the private returns might be below the social returns and individuals would otherwise underinvest in education. Okay, so that's one market failure explanation. Second is that education is the process of education, and the quality of the education that an individual is receiving is often something that's hard to observe, right? It's hard to know what the impacts are going to be on long-term outcomes and hard for individuals to gauge that. And so we can think of that as sort of an imperfect information environment or asymmetric information environment. And so when there's not good information on a market, and particularly on one side of a market, then we worry about poor choices or inefficient allocation of resources and kind of lack of pressures for efficient provision, if that's something that's hard to observe. And then from a higher education perspective, we think about credit market constraints, right? That an individual may not be able to use their future human capital as collateral to borrow against investing in current education. The other primary justifications fall under the equity camp, is that we think of education as being kind of a basic human right, that everyone, regardless of the circumstances that they were born into, should be able to have the opportunity to realize their full potential. Okay, so we have these equity and efficiency motives that I think motivate many government interventions around the world. What governments choose to do ends up being a whole variety of ways to intervene, right? So imagine that you want to encourage more investment in education, you could subsidize education. If you want to improve the information environment, so invest in establishing standards, measuring, performance measurement to try to make it more transparent to individuals what the quality is that they're receiving. Okay, so there's many different ways governments can intervene. Once they do, then the next thing that we worry about is what can be government failure, right? That when the government's now involved in a sector, maybe providing the good in the sector, is what are the incentives of those public officials, and do they really align with public interests? Okay, so countries get involved in very different ways. So the systems vary a lot across countries, and their effectiveness varies a lot across countries. And so I wanted to lead with some evidence. So it might be too hard to see. I highlighted in yellow the relevant countries in case it would be hard for you to see. Okay, but just two motivating figures that are at the level of education that I'm going to provide evidence about today. So this is going to be primary and secondary education, so not the tertiary sector. Okay, so what this first figure is showing, this is just a cross-country comparison. The x-axis is going to be the cumulative spending per pupil over ages 6 to 15. Okay, so just think and it's public expenditure. So this is government investment in education at this level. What's on the y-axis is going to be the average scores on a standardized math exam that's administered internationally. Okay, this is coming from OECD data. Okay, so what you can gauge just from a first, this is just one measure of government involvement, which is the fiscal aspect. Okay, but are four governments for how involved and how much they're spending per pupil, how much are they achieving as far as achievement? Okay, so Australia, I don't know if this has a pointer. Yeah, so Australia's right there. This down here is the OECD average. Okay, right next to Australia is the UK. So Australia and the UK are in similar position on this dimension. Okay, spend more than the typical OECD country, but are also achieving more as far as math outcomes, at least. This is math achievement. The US is notably spending even more for less, okay, with worse math achievement. Okay, so that's when we just start thinking about government involvement on the fiscal side and what, in fact, it's buying. And so what governments would ideally like to do is to move in this direction. Okay, spend less and get more for what they spend. Okay, this figure gets a little bit at the equity aspects. It's got the same y-axis. So the y-axis is, again, average math scores. So you can just think of the average level of achievement for students. What's on the x-axis now is the fraction of the variation in math scores that's explained by socioeconomic status. Okay, so if it's a higher share that's explained, you want to think of this as a system that's not really doing as good a job as compensating for individuals' backgrounds, right? That you can predict pretty well how someone's going to perform based on the background that they have. So good in this direction is, again, sort of the same direction. Okay, that more equal and higher average levels of achievement and less predictive for SES background. Okay, so in this figure, this is Australia. So Australia, the US, and the typical OECD country are kind of similarly unequal, meaning that the SES explains a similar share, and then I know UK is probably somewhat of a rival, is doing better. Okay, is actually doing a better job at bridging SES gaps for the level of average achievement that they're attaining. Okay, so thinking across countries and education policies, continuing reforms to education policies, as I said, we have the mission of improving both the equity and efficiency, and these are ongoing. I think every country continues to grapple with how to improve the system that they have. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is, as far as my specific studies, is some interventions that have been done in the context. These are going to be, in particular, in Texas, so the second most populous state in the US, over different time periods. So different efforts that the state has made to try to improve either the equity or the efficiency of its system. So Texas is interesting in the US context because it's had sort of a disproportionate impact on federal policy. Okay, the state experiments with things, and often those end up getting pushed to the federal level. Again, that's one of the nice things I think about having different states or different provinces, is that you can have the experimentation and then learn from what ended up working. Okay, but it'll be looking at Texas and elementary and secondary education. And I'll be looking at specific policies, both for efficiency and then equity. And as I said, there are first order things that we're hoping these policies achieve. What I often find interesting is the unintended effects of these policies. Okay, that we put in effect, we had this goal in mind, and then there may be behavioral responses that undermine achieving that goal, or maybe that achieve other goals. It doesn't have to be negative. Okay, but that's what we'll talk about, is some of the unintended consequences. Since we'll be moving on to talk about educating economists, something, so we bring more, that economists bring to evaluating education policy, I think is, first of all, our focus on incentives. Right, so thinking about, what drives decision-making, and, when you look at a policy and you get into the nitty-gritty of a policy, what incentives are you providing to the actors? And, there's some that's conceptual, qualitative, and then quantitative, right? So it could be that there's an incentive there, but it's not a margin that's very sensitive. Okay, but thinking about incentives is something that I think economists do a great job of. And then our methods training, of having the techniques and the skills to try to say, here's what the causal effects of those, and in my case, I'm going to look specifically incentives are on outcomes. Okay, and once we've quantified them, then we can put them into frameworks where we can trade off the pros and cons. Okay, so I want to be clear that I'm going to be looking at behavioral responses that are nested in what would be a much bigger question about optimal design, right? So just factors that you would want to take account of when you're deciding how policies should be structured. Okay, so it'll be just so you know what you're in for. So I'm going to talk about briefly 4 studies, and what I want to try to do in each case is I'm not going to go into depth in the studies, but just to lay out, so how in this setting I was thinking about the incentives. So how do I model what the incentives look like, and then what the design is to try to get at causal effects. Okay, so just highlighting these 2 aspects that I think economists can bring to the table. Okay, so the first 2 papers fall under this, efficiency motive for, so basically improving the efficiency of delivery of education. And they're going to be school accountability policies. So when, I've said already that education is, the process of education is somewhat opaque, right? It's hard to characterize exactly what's happening, so what a good education is, how to prescribe a good education. And so what governments often do is here's the process, they mandate both sides. Okay, so they've mandated the inputs, like maximum class sizes, maybe curriculum, right? Mandating what the curriculum's going to be, and on the other side, mandated the outputs. Okay, so what the student performance targets are. And so school accountability falls in that latter, so it's mandating the outputs. Okay, so what the student outcomes would be. And what it involves is setting up standards, performance measurement, and then, once performance is measured, so assessing how schools are doing relative to those metrics, and then maybe, it depends on the setting, rewards and punishments. Okay, so holding the schools accountable for the performance that they're attaining. Okay, so not just in the school setting, so in lots of settings, we know that there's a variety of pitfalls with these performance evaluation systems. Okay, and so what this figure is trying to capture is you start at the top, so we have schools, and there's lots of goals that we would have for schools. Right, so we want students to learn academic skills. We also want them to learn how to be good adults, civic engagement. So there's all sorts of emotional development, all sorts of things we would like schools to do. Only a subset of those are measurable. Right, so if we're going to have a performance evaluation system, we can only include in it things that we can measure. Right, we're going to need a metric to gauge it against. And so as soon as you narrow down the system to things you can measure, the first issue you run into is that you run the risk of diverting attention to those activities away from the things that you're unable to incorporate in your system. Okay, so that's the very first pitfall. The second is once you've chosen, let's say that we've decided we're going to focus on math achievement. Once you're focused on math achievement, we've got to have a specific performance metric, right? And let's imagine, and this is what's going to be common in the system that I'll be studying, is that it's the pass rate. Okay, so the fraction of students who achieve a specific level or a specific score on an exam. Okay, once you translate this math achievement goal into a pass rate, then there's additional kind of redirection of effort. Right? If it's a pass rate, if students who are really high achieving gain knowledge, it's not going to affect the pass rate. Right? They're always going to pass. And same thing, that if there's students who are so far from passing that I really have no chance of pulling them over this threshold, so you can have effort redirected to students at bubble, near the passing threshold, away from students at both ends. Okay, and also can have teaching to the test. Right? Because as soon as I said, here's the assessment I'm going to use, then that you might show up as, learning a great amount on this specific assessment, but not on other general assessments of the same skill. Okay, the next step is, so I'm talking about more breakdowns kind of in this measurement, is so we've got the math pass rate. So there is an underlying passing rate for the student population, right? If they all took the test, we would have a pass rate. That then there's scope for literal gaming, okay, where there's evidence in the US of teachers actually cheating. Okay, so cheating on the test, or the dimension I'm going to look at is manipulating the test-taking pool. Right, that if I can exclude the lowest performing students from taking the test, then I can manipulate the actual observed performance relative to what my students are attaining. Okay, and the last one is reported performance. So often, and I don't know if this happens we'll come back to the Australian system, but in a lot of settings, the way the information gets conveyed to the public is they might have access to the underlying continuous information, like in this example, pass rates, but it's often conveyed in binned categories, right, like letter grades. So, just separate bins. And so the public is getting crude, like a simplified version, and that binning can induce its own distortions. Okay, so the two studies I'm going to talk about fall in these last two categories. One's going to look at this gaming behavior, so manipulation of the test-taking pool, and the second one's going to look at distortions that come from binning this information when providing it to the public. Okay, so this, the setting that I'm going to look at is in Texas, as I was saying, where it is based on pass rates of students, and the schools are put into these categories during this study period. Unacceptable, acceptable, recognized, exemplary. Okay, so there are 4 different categories. And so in that type of setting where you have those bins, there's always an incentive, maybe because reputationally, but also in this setting, the ratings did carry consequences, so some financial consequences, that if you're close to a boundary, that's where you have even greater incentives to potentially manipulate the test-taking pool so that you can jump to that next category. Okay, and so that incentive is what I'm going to exploit that type of variation to try to identify the causal effects on this gaming behavior. Okay, so in Australia, I'm not sure if this is still true, so there's also these standardized exams, so the national, I don't know if this is the way you would pronounce it, but NAPLAN, that those produce scores for schools, right? So you've got the average scores that students receive, and those were reported to the public through these My School website, right? And Gigi has work showing that, so it's the same concept, right? That making that information public has reputational consequences for schools, and that particularly low-performing schools had increases in exemption rates for low-performing students. It's not just the gaming that we worried about, it's what are the consequences for the students who are implicitly getting left out of this whole system. Okay, so in this setting, the variation that I'm using, so I just wanted to show you the design, so it's the same concept, the exact same idea, is it's going to be trying to use the policy variations, so the thresholds, as the system was being rolled in, kept moving up. Okay, so what fraction of students needed to pass to fall into these different categories was moving up, say from 50% to 60% to 70%. And so what that's going to do is, depending on where a school's expected performance level is, their position relative to that threshold is going to be changing over time. And so these incentives, these kind of intensified incentives to get over a threshold, are going to be varying over time. Okay, and that's what I'm using to try to identify the causal effects. Okay, so I just wanted to show this one figure, because that's the part I often find fun with the economics, is just to think through, how do I think of these incentives? How would I model these incentives? And then in the data, how do I try to approximate these incentives? And so what this figure is showing is from the perspective of an administrator, right? If I know my student population, I know what their prior achievement levels are, I can predict what's the likelihood that they're going to pass this exam. Right? So imagine that for every student that's under my charge, I can get a predicted likelihood they'll pass. If I aggregate across students, if this is just averaging binomial distributions across students, I can get a distribution for the expected pass rate. Okay, and that's what the solid figure here is trying to show, or the solid distribution is. Imagine as an administrator, I have a mean expectation for the fraction of the students that'll pass, and that also has a distribution, right? So there's going to be a variance around this. More variable, the more students are close to that 50-50 likelihood. Okay, so then what this figure is trying to show is there's a threshold at, see if you can see the numbers. Yeah, so there's a threshold. Let's imagine the pass rate threshold to get to this next highest rating is 70%. Given that distribution, you can calculate what's the likelihood I'll exceed that threshold. Okay, and here it's going to be just that white area, past the 0.7 and under that initial distribution. Let's imagine that I, as an administrator, find a way to exempt students from taking the test. So encourage absences. I might classify them in disability categories where they're exempt. But if I remove the lowest performers, that's going to shift my distribution up. Okay, and the shaded area, A, is showing that if I were to shift it up, so that new shifted distribution, the increase in the likelihood that I achieve that higher rating. Okay, it's equivalent. I don't know if you can tell from the area, but you could do the same experiment by imagining that you have that 0.7 threshold, and what if that shifted down? Right, went from 0.7 to 0.69. It's actually going to trace out the exact same area. So the areas A and B end up being identical. And so the intuition for where the incentives are going to be greatest is, if you thought about moving down that threshold, it's just basically tracing out the original density of the pass rate distribution. And so the changes in the likelihood I pass are going to be greatest the closer you are, the closer my expected pass rate is to this threshold. Okay, but that's something I could calculate. So I can calculate that area A or that area B. And so that's what we do in the papers. We try to simulate, as the policy is changing over time, given what performance looked like, what's the predicted increase in the likelihood of attaining this rating from exempting, and we just choose different targets, like an additional 2% of students or additional 3% of students. And then in the analysis, we show that those year to year, so year-on-year changes in the fraction of the students who are tested are very well predicted by year-on-year changes in these kind of marginal benefits to exempting more students. Okay, so then the question is, well, so what do you do? How do we get around this loophole? And there's, I was wondering if this was in response to Gigi's paper, I'm not sure, but I noticed the My School website reports both the mean score and the fraction of students who are tested. Right? So it's at least providing information on some of this. Yeah, it's there. It's there. But what Texas did in response to this is put caps. Said you need at least a minimum participation rate of 95% or something. And so yeah, I think the tensions that we see in these kinds of policies when you have like moral hazard is there's, the reason that Texas did allow exemptions is that there are a set of students for whom the standard academic tests just aren't appropriate, right? They really need some sort of modified assessment, so it's meant to address that. And if you take away this flexibility, you of course risk, it's like type 1 and type 2 errors. And so there's, I think, just an inherent trade-off that's difficult to solve. Okay, but those are some of the responses are, providing the information and also putting limits on the amount of this that can be done. Okay, so the second paper that's related to school accountability, as I was saying, that's at that bottom level where we're taking the information and reporting it to the public, but reporting it in bins, is about the labor market, potential labor market distortions of doing that. And so this study is going to rely on a regression discontinuity design. And so the lowest category is low achieving, the next highest is, unacceptable, and then acceptable. And so the regression discontinuity, I think most of you are probably exposed if you're not. Think it as just comparing like right at the boundary, in which you can think of as just a random noise, whether the school ended up with a pass rate just below or just above the threshold. Right? It's just random noise. The school principals, so the leaders of the schools, should be equally effective. Right? There should be no systematic differences in their effectiveness. And so if there's differences in outcomes, that you could think of as an information failure, right? That by binning the information, we've told the public, these two principles are very different from one another. This one's unacceptable, that one's acceptable, where their underlying effectiveness is, in theory, should be otherwise identical. Right? There's no systematic differences between the two. And so what we find in this paper is that binning, that barely missing the acceptable threshold has very negative effects on the principal's labor market outcomes. And so this is the standard regression discontinuity picture. So this is the school pass rate just approaching the threshold for being acceptable. So on one side, it's showing the this pass rate and how it maps to the rating that you receive, and you can see it's close to full compliance. There's some exceptions that you can have a lower pass rate and still get the acceptable rating, but crossing the threshold, you go from being unacceptable to being acceptable. What's on the other panel is the likelihood that the school principal is retained, so continues in their position in the following year. And you can see that barely being rated as acceptable increases the likelihood by a great deal that I'll remain in the same position. Okay, so barely missing it means that I'm much more likely to be pushed out of my position. Okay, we look at a really broad range of labor market outcomes, including salary, and they're all negative. So this I would think of as, yes, we designed the system to provide information, but right at the boundary, it's actually providing misinformation. Okay, so some folks suggested, well, maybe that's still good, right? That you would think that maybe principals leading schools that are in this acceptable, unacceptable area, maybe they're all ineffective. And so if there's frictions that make it hard to fire principals, at least getting rid of one of them is a good thing. So if it leads to that kind of turnover, that could be good. What this figure is showing is kind of a more fundamental failure with what this accountability system looked like, is it did not do a good job at all of accounting for student composition, for the case mix of a school. So the figure on this side is showing the distribution of the average pass rate at a school for schools that receive different accountability ratings. Okay, and for the pass rate, you can see it's just monotonic, absolutely monotonic. Okay, that the schools with the lower pass rates are more likely to be unacceptable. Then as you move up, you're moving up to higher ratings categories. Okay, so it's largely the school pass rate that determines which category you fall in. So what determines the school pass rate? Sure, lots of things that a school principal can do, but the student body, right? If you happen to serve a really disadvantaged student group, this says as a principal, you're very likely to end up getting this low rating and having to suffer a labor market penalty. Okay, so this concern here is that it makes it harder to attract principals to schools that are disadvantaged. What's in the other panel is showing our best estimates of a principal's effectiveness, okay, which is the value added to learning that they causally provide at a school. And then we're showing the distribution of that effectiveness measure across the different ratings categories. And there's a lot more overlap. Okay, so the effectiveness of principals varies much less across schools. And in the low-performing schools, they are overrepresented in the lower tail, but also overrepresented in the upper tail. Okay, so it just says this is a poorly targeted policy if you're really trying to reward effectiveness. Okay, and that's kind of, I think, a general theme in schooling is that it's really important to find ways to case mix adjust. Okay, so we'll move on now. Move on now to the two that are dealing with equity. Okay, so the first is going to be school finance equalization, and the history in the U.S. is that we historically relied on local property tax funding, which led to inequities in per pupil resources across advantaged and less advantaged schools. And so there was a wave of school finance reform or school finance equalization where states got involved and tried to reallocate resources across districts to provide an adequate level of resources per pupil. Okay, and this is where the differences in the students came to play is the cost of education differs depending on whether you have a lot of English language learners, disabled students, poor students. And so the way that states try to account for those cost of education differences is through pupil weighting. Okay, so in coming up with the formula that you're guaranteeing this much per pupil, not every student counted as 1, some counted as 2, some counted as 4. Okay, and that was to try to account for these differences. Okay, and Australia has something similar to, I believe, under the school resources standard, okay, where there's factor loadings or student loadings, where some students count more than others. And so the issue in this paper is as soon as you put these loading in, where some types of students are more well remunerated, let's say, than other students, if that characteristic is not immutable, right, something that you can change, then school districts are going to have an incentive to basically upcode students. Okay, and so that's what this paper looks at, is how districts respond by labeling students as disabled in these more highly reimbursed categories when they have the incentives to do so. And so I'm running out of time, so I was going to tell you, I get what I wanted to I'll show you the slide because nobody will want to look at this very deeply. But the reason I wanted to show you this is I think something that we can bring as economists and also interacts with policy is the attention to like really getting into the nitty-gritty of the policy, like how does the school finance scheme work? And once I've mapped out how that school finance scheme works, what are the incentives? Like what is a dollar amount that a school district would get if it were to label a marginally slow-learning student, let's say, as disabled? Okay, and so once I can calculate that incentive, then I can use policy variation over time to identify the causal relationships. Okay, so I won't go through the math here, but there's a foundation program, a matching grant program, and where the redistribution happened changed over time in a way that it led to relative differences over time in the revenue gain to classifying marginal students. Okay, so this figure is showing patterns in this additional revenue that would be generated by reclassifying a student, and so year on year, so that change, and the change in the disability rate. Especially if you look at the high wealth districts, like these things just move lockstep. Okay, so I found a very high elasticity of the classification of students that explained, at this time period, there was a lot of concern about the increasing rates of disability classification, and it explained 40% of that growth. In this one, I won't show any figures, but I'll just explain the question, because this is my favorite, because I think it's actually kind of a positive and interesting spillover effect or unintended consequence. Okay, and so these college equalization policies, instead of trying to equalize resources at the beginning, come at the end. So after students finish secondary education and they're applying to universities, it equalizes access, kind of regardless of which school you went to. So it's going to equalize it across space. So they guarantee that every high school will have a fraction of their, say the top, in Texas is the top 10% of students in their graduating cohort are automatically guaranteed admission to actually every university in Texas, so including the flagships. Okay, and so the idea was to equalize college access. And I think Australia struggles with the same thing, which is under the merit-based admission system, one of the things that factors in really heavily is access to advanced coursework. In the US context, it's AP courses. That differs across advantaged and less advantaged areas, because you do end up with inequitable access. So these systems try to equalize it by geography. And what I think is interesting from the unintended consequence perspective is it's a tournament model, right? I want to get in the top 10%. And so for students who would otherwise like to be admitted to these flagship schools, but are not going to be in the top 10%, so they're strong students, they would apply, they'd be rejected, they have an incentive to change their school choice. Right? I'm going to pick a different pond. I'd rather compete in a less competitive pond if I can then gain access to this benefit. And so that's what this paper does, is it tries to model the incentives, like which students would have the incentive to change their high school course, their high school choice, because they could increase the likelihood of going to a flagship. And we find there's not that many, so it's a small fraction of students that have the incentive, but we find that the take-up among those students is relatively high. And the reason that I find this one super interesting is it's, the pressure is pushing towards destratification. So if you thought that was a positive outcome, that having people exposed to more similar peers, it did end up crowding out access to this benefit in practice among minority students. But it did end up equalizing peer quality across schools. So I think of it as a really interesting unintended destratification policy. Okay, and I will stop there. So just a general thought is that thinking through the incentives, thinking through the unintended consequences, sometimes we don't know if they're big or small until we actually estimate them. But thanks a lot for your time.
Stephen, I wasn't sure if you wanted to pop up and say this, but we have time for a few questions for Julie. So if anybody, do we have a mic runner maybe? Wonderful, Martin, thank you. So if anyone, we have probably maybe 5 minutes. So if you have a question, please put your hand up and we'll have Martin bring you the mic.
Hi. Yeah, that was a great presentation. I guess, sort of to borrow a pun, it feels like we have a bit of a principal-agent problem here, but the principal's the agent.
Exactly.
So I guess my question is, to that point, are there any examples where schools or school districts are offered a menu of contracts? So rather than evaluating a school as low, medium, or high-performing, you ask the schools whether or not they are low, medium, or high-performing, grade them as, use the testing to grade them, then offer, those incentives over time for, whether schools are doing better or doing worse. And whether or not sort of that idea of sort of offering contracts and differing incentives, depending on whether or not schools are telling the truth, is something that's been used in the literature.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I've seen a little bit of these efforts at the teacher level. So having teachers self-select into contracts that are more and less, reward effort, more or less. But at the school level, I'm not aware of any. I think there's an inherent kind of disciplining force that comes in through the dynamics, which is if you game today, you might make it harder for yourself tomorrow. And so there is research looking at the kind of ratchet effects that push against this kind of gaming.
Any other questions?
Ben from the Uni of Canberra. Thank you for the insightful presentation. I have 2 questions here for you. Because I came a bit late, so I may have missed your points. What is the school funding model in America? Because I did some research, I will represent my research this afternoon as well regarding school funding and effects of school funding on students' academic performance in Australia. And the second question is there any difference or big difference between public school and private school in America? Thank you. In terms of student academic performance.
Yeah, I'll start with the second one, which is I read a little bit about the Australian system, and Australia is relatively unique in how important the private sector is in, I think, secondary education. About a third of students go to private schools, but it's also, to me, unique in how integrated the private and the public sectors are as far as being required to meet the same standards. So it's a very unique environment. So in the US, the private sector is smaller and also free from a lot of the regulations of the public sector. So when people try to evaluate school performance, they often can't evaluate private schools because we don't have the data. Right? They're not subject to the same mandatory testing. But I would say also serve different populations. On the funding side, so there's no single funding model, but I just say the broad picture is that the federal government at the elementary and, the primary and secondary levels is not a major player. Maybe funds 10%, and it's more compensatory funding for low-income students. And then the states differ in their way they set up their systems. So every state is different, but over time, the major trend has been greater state funding and less local funding. Okay, but whether they do it through foundation grants, which is I'm going to guarantee you a certain amount per pupil for levying a required tax rate, or through other means differs across states. There's a lot of heterogeneity. Sure.
One more question.
Hi, Sam Bruce, student at UNSW. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. Most of what you've discussed has been around how schools might game various performance metrics, etc. I think it's Goodhart's law that any metric is going to become a bad metric eventually. What should we be getting schools, universities, educational institutions to optimise for, particularly if we want them to optimise for more than just immediate employability, but long-term critical thinking? Because it seems to me at least that across the world, certainly in Australia, we've had this general drift toward optimising for short-term metrics rather than that longer-term outlook. How do you do that?
So I'll start with an easier question, which is that I think some of what we saw about the gaming comes from not giving every student a chance to demonstrate success. And so I would say like value-added measures are much better than pass rates. So any student has a chance to improve. And so I say that's the very first step. The other is that there's more effort in trying to map, so in the US, there's a lot of concern about for-profit universities taking advantage of federal funds, which often come from military budgets, and not providing quality education. So for the students, it's almost free, and the outcomes have often been viewed to be poor. So there's been a major effort to track earnings, I think, which is not critical thinking, but at least it's moving towards getting at longer lifetime outcomes. So I think as the data and measurement improve, that we'll get better at getting that mapping. Good point.
Just, there was one more question? Okay. Oh, there, okay.
Thanks for the presentation. It's Helen from Economic Pocket. I was wondering that in the research, it's very interesting. We look at the data and the different metrics, but I was wondering, do you care about the inequality? Because I think that economic literacy and financial literacy is universal subject, so we shouldn't exclude anyone from this subject. So in the research, do you cover every school, or do you have a distinguished access to this subject from private and public school or different states in Australia? And do you look at the other data from other countries like US or OECD country as well? Thank you.
So were you saying that, so I'm not sure, I think I missed the essence of the question. So it's whether there's a way we can look at the inequality between public and private?
Yes, so my question is, economic literacy and financial literacy is a universal subject. So in the research, do you cover the accessibility?
No, I got it.
Yeah, in the across public, private school and different states and different regions in Australia as well? And do you look at the data from US and other OECD countries to see how we perform in the system? Thank you.
So I have actually done very little cross-country work. This was, you guys have seen it. So most of the work that I've done has been based in the US setting, but I think one of the really neat things about the OECD PISA is that it really is trying to dig into, which countries seem more effective at getting systematic advances on one level or another. As far as the economic literacy, I would say the US school system, and that comes back a little bit to the critical thinking skills, is that it's sometimes overemphasizes, students don't take economics, they don't take home economics, so just these basic skills are often missing up through secondary school. What's really forced on students, and this is fully subjective, is calculus. Right, so almost, if you want to succeed, you take calculus, you take 2 years of calculus in high school, and I think the fraction of people who use that in their career is trivial. And I wish they took statistics, because I think understanding statistics and being able to critically think about the data that's presented to you is so much more important than calculus if you're not going to use it. And algebra, like being able to do ratios, say you're a nurse, like my husband was, who doesn't understand ratios. Yeah, so I think that there are ways we could adjust the curriculum. Thanks.
So just before I ask for another round of applause for what I thought was a fantastic presentation and a really thought-provoking speech, I suppose my two observations were, one, that many of the problems that we think about, they're clearly not ours alone. They're grappling with them across the world, in particular Texas. The other is, what struck me was, thinking about these problems as an economist, it gives us some really great insight into, I say solutions, but also problems with those solutions, and I think that's really worthwhile. So again, join me in thanking Julie for a really fantastic presentation.